So I think we'll go ahead and proceed with our first, I think, AYR of the year. Don't lose it, talking about designing your personal preservation plan or your personal research preservation plan. We are data librarian Nina and archivist Margaret talking about preservation planning, especially, but not only for your research. I'm Nina, and let me tell you our objectives before I pass it on to Margaret to give the important part, and then it'll come back to me to talk about how the important stuff then plays out in a research and data context. We'll be sharing a 5-step cycle that archivists use to assess needs for preservation, including different needs for backups versus archival copies of your records and data, and some tips for organizing. We'll also share some specific local policies about your research documents and research data that you may or may not know, like VCU's security catalog, security categories, and data ownership policy. So with that, on to Margaret, our expert in digital archiving.
Hello, and thank you for that introduction, Nina. Again, I'm Margaret Kidd, and I'm going to be talking to you about these 5 steps today. But before we dig into the topic, you may be asking, why is this important? Digital content is more fragile and vulnerable than people realize. A flash drive is easily lost, a laptop can be stolen, an external drive may inexplicably fail, etc. You must also think about the lifespan of your data. You may only care about maintaining it for a short period of time, but a project could take years, or you may want to maintain it for an indefinite period of time. So I want you to think about this. If you put a hard drive and a box of papers on a shelf, which of these will you be able to read in 50 years? It's unlikely that you can access the data in the hard drive because you won't have the hardware software to access it. Whereas with the papers, you'd be able to pop the top and read away. So how do you deal with all of this uncertainty? Next slide, please. You make a plan. And while you can't plan for every contingency, having a plan will make maintaining your data that much easier. So these are the 5 steps that I would ask you to keep in mind. What do you have and where is it? Deciding what has long-term value, organizing it, the 3-2-1 rule, and revisit. Bear in mind that the concepts I'm talking about apply to any born digital materials you have, whether it's your research or your personal digital photos. And this information can aid you after you leave VCU. Next slide. So what do you have and where is it? If you are beginning a project with this in mind, it will be easier to manage. You can plan for how you want to keep up with your data. For example, keep everything on your computer and backed up to an external storage. If you're in the middle of a project or have finished and are deciding on what you want to preserve, now's the time to gather everything and or document its location. And of course, I love this particular XKCD cartoon because it's a great illustration of all of the different kinds of files that we amass over time and we probably forget about. So that's why I included that here. Next slide, please. After you've figured out what you have, you need to decide what has long-term value. In the world of archives, this is called appraisal. Archivists have long known that it is impossible to keep everything. As a result, archivists make decisions about what to retain based on numerous factors such as potential research value, uniqueness, if it fits into our collection development policy, etc. So I want you to think like an archivist and ask yourself these questions. Is it important or unique? Is this my final draft? Can I find it someplace else? Does this have future use? And are there retention requirements for funders? There may be some other questions you ask yourself along the way. But when it comes to preservation for the long term, the key is to preserve that which is unique, important, or difficult to find or replicate. So for example, if you have original data, you're going to want to keep that. You probably don't need to keep the 6 different drafts of your thesis or dissertation, only the final one. Did you save journal articles while doing a literature review? If so, keep the citations rather than the article, as those are accessible via other avenues in the future. A citation manager can help you with this. Of course, though, if something is very difficult to find or access, then you may want to keep that. If your project is active, then you can still think about the long-term value and what you will want to maintain after it's completed. Next slide. So now you want to organize it. Deciding what to keep is half the battle. Once you've chosen, you can focus on organizing your materials. Chances are you already have a system for naming and filing your digital materials. If you are starting a project, now is a good time to decide on a file structure and naming convention. Adding a README file, which documents the file structure, file naming, and version specifications, is an easy way to manage your data and has the added benefit of helping anyone else who may access this information in the future, including yourself. Something else to consider is the format of your files. Will you be able to open these in a few years? One way to ensure that you can open a file is to use an open source format such as OpenOffice, or save final copies as a PDF. Next slide, please. And in this case, for file naming and versioning tips, Google is your friend. There are a lot of sites out there that provide best practices for file naming and version control, but here are some of the things that you should remember. You want to keep your file name short, consistent, and meaningful. Definitely avoid special characters. A lot of systems don't like them, and especially if you are ever doing any kind of command line interaction with your files, these characters can be very problematic. So instead, you should use either an underscore, which is my personal favorite, dashes, or camel case, which is where you have a capital letter at the start of each word. Don't use spaces because, again, that can cause problems with certain systems. And then if you are using a date format, always use the year, month, day version of the date. And with version control, use the date, a version number, or a status that you've devised, or any combination thereof. And there are also tools that you can use. A couple of those are bulk rename utility, which is a Microsoft compatible product, works with Windows, and another one is Hazel, and that works with Macs. Next slide, please. So now we're to store it and back it up. This rule is pretty straightforward. It's 3 copies of your digital materials with 2 different types of storage and 1 copy in a separate location. The different types of storage could be your computer and an external hard drive. Saving a copy to cloud storage works as both one of your copies and a separate location. Or your separate storage location could be an external drive kept at your office or a relative's home. Next slide, please. And we're going to take a quick detour before we get to the final step. The term archive and backup are often used interchangeably, but there is actually a difference between the two. A backup copy typically refers to a copy of data that is currently being used and or altered. So in other words, it's not the finished product. You keep a backup in case your primary copy is lost, damaged, or corrupted so that you can restore from it. An archive refers to data that is fixed and unchanging, or in other words, the final form. When you are planning for preservation, an archive is what you want. The reason you keep 3 copies, as mentioned in the previous slide, is so that you have a backup in case something happens to one of your archival copies. This distinction is important to consider if you plan on using a service such as Google Cloud Storage or Amazon Web Services or any of the other types of storage systems that are out there. It might not be as much of an issue while you're here at VCU, but it's something to keep in mind after you go out into the broader world. For a backup, you want a storage class that allows you quick access. That access usually costs you more money. So again, that's where you would keep your backup that you want to restore from, but it's not something you're probably going to keep indefinitely. For an archival copy, that you likely won't access very often, you can assign it to a deep or cold class. So think Amazon Glacier is a good example. And this is a much cheaper way to store your data. It's pennies to do so, but it does take longer to access it if you need to. Next slide, please. And finally, this is not a one and done exercise. I often compare digital preservation to a relay race. It's something that's going to be ongoing and that you hand off over time if you want your information to endure. So you should periodically review your materials and schedule regular backups. It's also vital to migrate and refresh your media. So migration means moving files from one format to another to ensure that you can still access it. An example of this would be moving a WordPerfect document to Word or moving a Word document to the newest version of Word. Refreshing media refers to transferring files to new storage media to avoid physical decay or obsolescence. For example, an external hard drive has a typical lifespan of 5 years, so it's recommended that you transfer the content to a new drive when the current one approaches the end of its useful life. And once again, XKCD comes in with a delightful comic, My Access to Resources on a Particular Subject Over Time. And you can see that a book on a subject is going to be stable and readily accessible for a long time. And at the very bottom, you see microfilm, which is also a very stable medium for maintaining information because all you need is a magnifier and a light source. But in between that are all of these different types of digital files and media that for whatever reason fail due to accident, damage, no longer maintained, what have you. So it's just a good way to look at the lifespan of materials, and you can see that digital materials just don't last as long as we tend to think. They're so ubiquitous that we just tend to think of them always being around. But if you've ever lost a file, which I'm sure all of you have, you know that's not the case. And next slide, please. And this brings us to the end of our 5 steps. You'll have access to these slides and resources, but I wanted to point these out to you. This General Personal Digital Archives resources is a document that I've maintained for a variety of audiences, and it includes information beyond what I've discussed here. But I wanted to point out that I do have a section on VCU specific links materials, and of particular note, I wanted to highlight the Educopia Institute ETD Plus guidance brief. They're very short, as the name implies, but packed full of information, and I highly recommend that you check these out to give you some extra guidance and tips. And then also in the VCU section, I have linked to Citation Tools research guide. If you haven't already picked a citation manager, I recommend that you look into that. It's very useful for while you're conducting your research, but an added benefit of it is that it's a good way to manage your citations well into the future. And depending on how you want to maintain your materials, you could also use it to keep copies like screenshots of web pages, save copies of PDFs of journal articles and such that you want to maintain into the future. So you could add that as one of your tools in your digital preservation toolkit. And then also there is a link to the research data management research guide, which is being managed by our very own Nina. And with that, I will segue over to Nina to let her talk about the rest of this. So thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. And I'm going to try to take the process from Margaret, the archival thinking process, and transform it into the research context and talk about what is research about it. So, I mean, digital archiving, though, is important for everything these days, from MP3 rips and image scans of your BTS straight from Korea photo book CDs to how we customized our socially distanced favorite bread recipes to course homework, of course. But research has a lot of its own issues that are a little different from the rest of digital preservation. And so we want to think about how sometimes the files for our research either need special security, have much more complicated ethical concerns than material that we've created entirely ourselves. And there might be a lot of files, a huge amount, like documentation of consent that is in associated records that needs to stay with the data, or the visualizations and graphs and PDFs of journal articles or dissertations. So there may be a lot of historical documents, publications, or other associated records that you need to pay attention to as well. When you make your final archive folder, so I'm going to work from where we were just now, where Margaret left us, and then I'm going to jump back a little bit. When you make your final archive folder, you're going to want to think as though you may be leaving the topic and then coming back to it at not your graduation job, but your next job, or not this grant or journal publication, but your next one. It's not unusual to leave a research topic and then come back to it at a different point in time. So you want enough information with your data and research files to help remind you of the details if you come back in several years. We also change our scholarly data a lot. And so sometimes we also use special software to change that, or we keep doing complicated processes in our data cleaning that have lots of different steps, or analytical code we may write that has lots of different steps. And we may need to step backwards to particular stages. So when we make the final archive of our project that Margaret mentioned at the end, we want to think about several different parts of it. As I mentioned, you may be coming back in 8 years, even maybe. So a file with enough notes to explain to another researcher or yourself. Let's then say that I have some microscope fluorescence data that comes out of my microscope, and I analyze it with a software package called Lighter, and that gives me a sheet of numeric reflectance and absorbance data. So I've got the visual data that comes out, I've got a software that I use to transform it, and then I've got some final data that I use to write my dissertation or journal article or whatever. I want to have the raw data because I can't, without going back to those same samples, I can't regenerate that raw, fresh out of the microscope data. I want to have the final data that has all the work that I put into transforming it. And I want a copy of that Lighter software package in case I come back and check this data in 5 years. I want to come back and use it to maybe compare some new data in a similar topic, but they've stopped making that Lighter package, for example. Whether it's a small software company where someone made a great programmed their own great program for their lab and then decides to make a little company where they sell that, and ooh, this is the best software ever. Maybe that company gets bought up and the software stops being made. Or whether it's an open source software where a small community is maintaining it, but then they're like, maintaining the software is a lot of work and I've got other stuff I need to do. Software disappears all the time. So you want the raw and the final and any really important analytical subsets. And as Margaret already mentioned, the appropriate documents, records, anything that can't be replaced and is really essential to understanding it. I can't talk about research data without talking about data security, because lots of research stuff cannot be stored just anywhere on any USB drive that you want to put it on. There's broadly 3 things to think about when you consider what type of storage and backup options you have for data specifically. This category of how sensitive your data is, permission from the data steward, since we as researchers probably don't really own our data, or may not at least. And then ethical and licensing obligations, whether to people or to IP or to good practice in our profession. And thinking about those things will come together to help inform your security choices. Let me break those three things down with a little more detail. By the way, we'll be sharing these slides, so the links and so on will come with them. The data classification tool at go.vcu.edu/data classification will help you figure out if you need the strictest security, which is category 1, something that has more storage options than that in category 2, or data that you can put anywhere you want because it's not sensitive at all, category 3. That would affect which cloud storage backup options you can use. You may not know this, but usually even if I'm collecting data and I'm studying the data, I don't own the data. VCU owns it, especially, but not only, if it's part of a grant or otherwise funded research assistantship, where even if I decide that I'm going to leave academia and I'm going to go collect seashells and sell them at Virginia Beach, the university still owes work to the grant funder. So VCU has to have some ownership so that they can do that, and I, as a researcher, steward my data. That varies a little bit, but you will want to check with your PI, or if you're a PI, with your research dean, and read the data ownership and stewardship policy before you take the final archive with you, especially, but even before you pick your backup choices. Ethically, when I talk about data ethics, I usually think first about human subjects and the IRB, Human Subject Research Protection, because people are the most important ethics. And I can't overemphasize that you have to align your consent process, if you're working with human subjects, with your sharing and backing up processes. Consent forms always control what we can do with data. That's even if the IRB is closed or I'm exempt from IRB. Closed and exempt don't mean that the ethics aren't important, just that the IRB isn't actively watching the process of handling the data. Ethics are never exempt. We're never exempt. We're never closed from our ethical obligations to interviewees or patients or informants or any kind of human subjects that we work with. We may have other ethical considerations too, though. Ethics don't just mean human subjects research. For example, I may have a duty to the lands of a tribal people who allow me to do ecological field work on a reservation. And that may be a verbal or oral tradition sort of discussion, but I still have an ethical obligation to respect those lands and to give back to the tribe or the community. I may go into some community participatory research and ask people to work with me. I owe that community back some kind of results, which may affect where I can put my final findings, my final documents. I also owe them some privacy, even if I don't have an IRB obligation. So I need to treat those things with respect. I may have intellectual property limitations. I may have a data use agreement. I may even click a license button where I say, I agree, before I download some data. And even if I didn't read exactly what I agreed to, it still affects me. And so I probably need to go back and read that, or ask someone, what did that say? Those all affect us and continue to affect us for the entire life of our data. So those should be considered as well during our selection of where to store and back up. Once we know our category and we've thought about other ethical considerations, we can visit dms.vcu.edu to find out some storage and transmission options. It can tell us things, and of course it's going to ask me to log in again now. I swear I tested this before. It can tell us things like whether the student Google Drive or the employee Google Drive is the appropriate Google Drive for storing my particular type of information. So if I have category 1 data, it will tell me what's definitely good, what's maybe good, but I need to talk to IT, and what's definitely not good for storing, network usage, and the VPN. If for some reason I'm doing my analysis working from home for 1.5 years, even though I didn't expect to, and transmission for sharing to other collaborators. Now, to bring this to the real world, though, none of us ever has enough time to be perfect about everything. Things sometimes go well, and sometimes they don't. Like Margaret said, digital stuff is really fragile. We think it's not because the internet is everywhere, and I bought a new iPhone and all of a sudden all of my settings and apps and photos and everything were there. But it really is much more fragile than you think it is. And yet our research depends on digital documents. So do as I say and as I did. During my dissertation, I picked the most important stuff, especially my analysis documents and my dissertation writing. I was on the slow track, so it took me 8 years to finish my degree. And so I backed up with the 3-2-1 process, like we described, saving the working file and then a save as to my laptop with each work session. Then weekly, I copied out to an external drive. So that was my 2, and one separate different place backup on my school's cloud drive. My data had higher security, so I only had 2 copies because I couldn't figure out a third place. I had 2 that I was working with on my secured laptop, and then I did my one offsite with my cloud storage. So it wasn't as ideal as if I'd had backups in different locations, but still I stuck with that one offsite, which is really important to this story because as will probably happen to every dissertation writer, my laptop died during the process of my 3 years working on my dissertation. What made it extra exciting, though, was it died with a hard drive crash as I was saving out my backup copy to my external hard drive. It was in the middle of writing to the external hard drive, and that meant that the drive died as well. So I lost both my laptop and the attached external hard drive that was my backup location. If I had not also had that second offsite save, I probably wouldn't have bothered finishing my PhD because it would have been lost. Everything would have been lost. It would have been not worth trying to do the whole thing over again. So I definitely recommend that your dissertation writing is the thing that you should really want to make sure that you're doing your 3-2-1s with. On the other hand, do as I say and maybe not as I do. I was also working with my committee members, as we do, and they were writing me lots of notes back, as they do, to give me advice on how I could do better. And at one point, I decided I was going to sort of prune off one analytical direction because it was a little too big for the dissertation. And one of my committee members said, "That's great. Here are some intense notes that will be helpful for that part you're pruning off if you want to come back to it later. And so I had that separate set of feedback. It was a lot of feedback, but it wasn't part of my dissertation, so I didn't keep working with it along with the rest. It was just a copy that had this separate feedback. And I was working on it in the cloud. I had my save in my email, and I had a copy out to my cloud storage, but I didn't keep a local copy. And then when I came back to it after I had finished my dissertation last year, and I was like, I want to take this separate direction and see if I can do it as a new journal article, come back to it and finish that analytical direction. And it was not in my email. And IT had done an email purge since then of anything that was too old. I couldn't find it in my cloud backup. I swear I was keeping separate versions, but I went back through every single file looking for this thing, to the point where I'm like, maybe I just dreamed that whole conversation. I don't know. So probably what happened is I overwrote the version that I had in the cloud without keeping the versioning turned on. And since my email storage had been purged due to old age and my transition from student to alumnus, and I was relying entirely on the cloud, I lost the whole thing. So that wasn't as critical a loss as losing my dissertation, but it was an inconvenience. I probably should have been more planny and appraisal-y with that. I'm going to go through an example step by step, a mock case example. I probably won't have time to go through every example, every stage of the assessment process with this. They'll be in the slides in case we don't get to the end. My case study, my mock case study, is a research student who's doing some art and some science. I'm trying to make a case that you can understand whether you're using Western blot gels or whether you are scanning medieval documents and trying to do an analysis of the ink and writing styles, or anything in between. So let's imagine a thesis or dissertation writer working to analyze elements of neurological images from neuroscience and neuroimaging. So we're talking about brain scans and brain cells and spinal cells and so on, that they're going to use for an artistic rendering of the front of a possible science building. So they're trying to make something that's evocative of the science that the scientists in the building would be doing. So the people and their colleagues, when they come into the building, will say, hey, that sculpture reminds me of fMRI project that I'm working on looking at the cerebellum. Or, hey, there's these artistic drawings of glial cells pressed into the cement of the walkway. How clever is that? I don't know. I'm not an artist. I don't really understand artistic analysis. I apologize, but let's imagine someone who is. Let's try to pretend. And they go to the main 5 steps for preservation analysis. What do you have and where is it? Or what do they expect to have and where will it be? What do they think will have the most long-term value to them? How do they want to organize it? What's their 3-2-1 plan? And then when will they revisit it afterwards? And I'm going to work in with those, the research specifics of when you think of what has the long-term value, what are the ethics going to be? What is the security classification going to be? And when you think of what you'll have and where it is, think of all those associated documents, the data, but also records and publishing and everything that might be part of it. So I'm going to try to work those in to our process. What is this, our imagista likely to have? So they may have images of brain scans as they do their inventory. They're going to have to ask for some pictures of brain scans. They're going to look for medical illustrations and artistic diagrams of brain cells and brain anatomy and spinal anatomy. As they start to do their literature, their review and start to read up, they learn that there are certain colors that are used in neurological cell research to stain and make cells show up a certain way. They learn there are specific expected colors used in PET scans and CAT scans and MRIs. And so they may develop some color palettes or lists of colors that would evoke that microscopy and PET scans and CAT scans. They also plan to take photos and sketches of a potential site for their study in order to see how the light might affect things and how angles might look at things. So there's a lot of files. I'm going to call those data, even though as an artist, probably they don't think of this as data. They may think of it as an image morgue or other kind of collection. They probably don't think of it as data, but I'm going to call it data anyway. Once they think of what will they have, they also think of where will they have it? Well, there's so much more stuff to getting a hold of this. They have to find all of this stuff. They need to maybe send off to researchers and ask them, do they have examples of scans that they can share? Those are people's brain scans, so they may not be able to share a lot of it, but they may have some contacts or some friends of friends of friends that they can get a hold of. They're going to have to get those sent, though, via email or Dropbox or File Locker, which is a secure file transfer. They don't have it themselves. So those are going to be places where it is. They'll probably do, as we all do, a lot of web browsing and you know how you get tons of tabs on a certain topic and then you want to save those tabs into bookmarks for later. That's something that sometimes I forget when I'm doing documentation analysis and thinking like, what are all the things that I need? I've got a bazillion tabs on this topic. I need to preserve the bookmarks if those are essential content. I may want to even PDF some of the most important or print out some of the most important websites. I mentioned the color palette, so they may have some Excel spreadsheets or Google Sheets or just Word documents where they've taken notes of how they're developing their color choices. They're an artist, so they're sure to have hard copy of doodles and sketches. They may have paintings that they need to scan. They may also talk to people who work in brain labs and scan some copies of those people's lab notebooks to understand more about the inspirational and scientific process of how scientists go through the process of research. And then finally, if they take photos of the site, they've probably got those photos in their phone or on iCloud, and those may need to be transferred or organized as well. And then, Margaret, kind of thinking about Margaret's process here and archival evaluation and appraisal has actually just now, just as we were preparing for this process, made me think a little bit differently about how I would plan for my data management planning for the long term. So there's this huge pile of stuff, but most of it is creative inspiration and brainstorming. So our Imagista would, if they're thinking in advance, they probably would decide that they want to keep all the files as long as possible until their dissertation or thesis defense.
Nina, we've lost sound. I don't know if you accidentally dislodged your mic cord. Oh, there you are. I can hear you now.
I didn't change anything that second.
I don't know. You might have just like knocked it loose.
Okay. I'm going to try to stop moving then. But I can't talk if I don't move my hands. Okay. Our Imagista has is probably going to decide that only the most hard to replace things and things that they might need if they ever present this design as part of a an advocacy presentation to an architectural firm about actually doing this project. So they need their personal sketches about the process, anything that they might need to explain the installation itself, and then any specific images that would be very convincing to and someone they were trying to explain the design's scientific conceptualization and inspiration. That leads into the organizing part, and our instinct is usually going to be to either organize by who gave us something or what the type of thing is, like brains versus cells, or just by time, I got this thing first and this thing second. But because of this appraisal process and thinking about it in advance, what would they need long term, they would probably have decided that the main organizing principle needs to be by, do they use it in the final design or do they not use it in the final design? So I've got all of these brainstorming sketches, all of these photos and brain scans and cell images, but only some of them are going to end up being directly tied to the final rendering of the facade and front walkway. So they probably need a folder structure that says, I might use this file and I did use this file. Their README would need to document a file naming convention that might be used dash chapter 4 dash 2 dash color scheme versus not used dash Western blot of spinal fluid. Something that separates out their use and not use as the highest priority. They also need to think about accessibility of file formats, particularly because if you're working with images, you might be using a commercial product like Adobe Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator or Adobe whatever that you can get as a student at VCU, but that you may not choose to pay for in the long term as an independent contractor, or that your company may not have if it's an architectural company that mainly works with AutoCAD and not Adobe products, for example. So any of the multi-layered images, any of the Adobe only images may need to be exported to PNG or GIF or JPEG format so that the person can always get it. That's a big problem there. And then we would want to add descriptive metadata and tags so that it's searchable, because always our first step is going to be to use search to try to find our files if it's not obvious which file to start with. Once we've thought about all that, we can go to the data classification tool and say what kind of stuff we have. So our artist scholar needs to know whether the data that they've asked people to send them, the brain scans and cellular images, which of those might be controlled human subjects information. Now, there is some human stuff that would be category 2 because it can't be connected with the person. And there's other human stuff that's category 1 that can be connected to a person, or maybe that has a data use license because it's from an industrial imager that company that does the imaging said you can use this, but only as long as you're a student, and then you need to shred the file or something. So they need to ask, when they get their sources of images, when they get those images shared with them, are these under any special terms of use? And then they could use the data classification tool to decide, is this category 1 or category 2 or category 3 data? Again, because we've got some brain scans, we need to think whether there is any human subjects. That's probably going to be determined by the source of the data, who may also assign a data use agreement. But if it's all anonymous and there's no ethical back to the donors of the people who had the brains that let us use the scans, then we may not have to have too many ethical concerns. But it's always important to think that part through. Oop. Once we know the category, ownerships, ethics, and other licensing and compliance requirements or other restrictions, we can check the data management system. We may have to split it where there's just a couple of things, maybe DNA sequences or something, that have to be stored on an encrypted drive or in REDCap. There might be just a small part of our working data, our short-term backups, that only has a few places it can be backed up to, but then the majority of the data might be able to be stored separately. So maybe I need to do 2 separate types of backup locations. So I'd want to set a calendar, or they'd want to set a calendar, set up a to-do list. If you play Habitica, like I do, you might set up a daily prompt to do a save as copy on the laptop so that every time I've made a change that is documented, I'm reminded to document that with a save as, and then another weekly to-do reminding me to do a backup with anything that's category 1 being backed up to an encrypted drive, and anything that's not category 1 or 2, and like my personal sketches possibly, are separately, they can be backed up wherever. And then maybe a monthly backup, although it might need to be more frequent, to a cloud server. Again, Google Drive, if it's category 3, maybe if it's category 2, but usually not. Most people are going to use Google Drive whenever they can, though. If I have a couple of highly controlled genetics, for example, that might need to be backed up to a REDCap database. At the end, they're ready to graduate. I've defended my dissertation. Thank goodness. Remember that they're hoping that after graduation, they may be able to present this at an architectural firm. Maybe they're doing an internship, or maybe they just have some contacts. They're thinking they might be able to really present this, and that means going in a conference room and doing a PowerPoint or a whiteboard presentation with real people making real job decisions. And that firm would want to see the final renderings, of course, but they might also want to see the scientific images, because in that presentation, the person's telling the story of why you don't just want to make something that's academic. We want to add these artistic touches that will inspire and possibly recruit scientists. And so those, and the annotation about some README annotation or some documents about how that came about, so that they could make that presentation if they get the chance in a year or 2, maybe, needs to go in their archival copy that they're taking with them. And then anything that would be really hard to replace, but they might need, like literature review materials that prove an important point, although they might also pack up their citation manager, their Zotero files, so that they've got citations to the bigger list, and they're not looking through their bibliography trying to remember from the 20 pages of bibliography at the end of their dissertation. And then they put that in an archive location. At this point, anything that was identified or under a data use agreement should have been gone. That should be shredded. They need to make sure they do that like they agreed to. And then finally, they set a calendar reminder a year from now to revisit it, make sure that if it's on a drive, that drive is still good. And if the drive is approaching end of life, that they check it and move it to another location, and so on. That way they'll always have it in case they do get that chance to give a presentation for an awesome artistic job. That might be really overkill for anything other than a dissertation or a big grant and then our final grant report closeout. But remember that thinking realistically in advance can save hassles. Our judgment when we're at the point where we're like, okay, honey, yes, I'm coming to dinner. Sorry, let me just hit save on this real quick so that I don't lose it. Our judgment at that point is probably not very good, and we may not notice that the cat just hit delete and removed a whole column of our spreadsheet or removed all the text and in a document, and we hit save and that saves over a good file with a bad file. Those kinds of things happen all the time. And if our approach is like the wonderful PhD comics final draft, if our approach is to just name it randomly each time, it's going to be really hard to find, say, final Rev 6 comments doc out of the entire pile of all of the final revision 18 comment 7 corrections 9 more .30 doc that we end. So as much as we can do in advance, we want to. Whew, that was a lot. I'm kind of surprised that I got through the whole case. I didn't think I would. This is our contact information, and do you have any questions? Looking at the chat in case anyone puts chat questions, or you can unmute or ask to unmute, I think, if you want to discuss any specific examples that you have.
And while we're waiting, I will say one thing that I didn't mention during the presentation, but this can seem very overwhelming. But the biggest thing to remember is that doing something is always better than doing nothing. Because if you do nothing, then you are guaranteed to lose it.
Yeah, I agree, especially with research, which is a long process, but we do it in little bits at a time. It is always better to think about it in advance than to wait for the moment that we're trying to hit save, or we've just finished a big run and we've gotten our sequences out and we're like, oh, I'm so tired.
And it is possible that we've overloaded you with so much information. Now you have to let your brain think on it for a bit. So if you do find that you have questions after the fact, you're always welcome to contact either of us to ask advice.
Absolutely. Our contact information is at the end. The videos will be posted on the AYR website in a few weeks with an improved transcript. If we talked too fast, I tend to slur a bit, so there will be an edited transcript that may help make it more understandable. And you're always welcome to have us come and talk, do some brainstorming, especially if you have a lab or a team that you're working with. We could come in and brainstorm with the whole team on what might make things easier to get between people, especially. That's sometimes the hardest part when you've got 10 different people working on the same set of data. All right, well, thank you so much for coming.